So, hello everybody. A very warm welcome, and it is warm tonight, to the Australian Institute of International Affairs here in New South Wales. Welcome equally to everyone, but a couple of special mentions. It's a great pleasure to welcome our National Executive Director, Dr. Bryce Wakefield, down from Canberra, to welcome the relatively new Director of the New South Wales Office of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Crispin Conroy AM, and last but not least, Matt Brown from the ABC, who's come along to keep an eye on the rest of us. So, welcome everybody. Our event tonight is called An Australian Diplomat in the Arab World. Tomorrow there will be apricots. Now, I haven't checked this with Bob, but someone told me during the week that tomorrow will be apricots is roughly equivalent to saying pigs might fly. Is that, yes? I got a nod. That's encouraging to know. So Bob's going to discuss his recently published memoir of that name, and I think as well tell us quite a bit about his career in those countries of the Middle East, which for any of us who know them are both fascinating and I think all too often tragic. Bob himself retired from Foreign Affairs in 2008 after a 37-year career, much of it focused on the Arab world. I'm not going to ramble on about him because the only reason you're here is that you've read about him before coming. So I'm going to hand straight over to Bob Bowker.
Thank you very much, Ian, and good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm very grateful to the AAAA New South Wales for the invitation. It's great to see an old friend in Ian, and I particularly want to thank Jennifer Sale for handling the sales of the memoirs out there. The children will eat meat tonight. People sometimes have referred to my career as being distinctive, and I'm not quite sure why they do that. I had 5 Middle East postings over the 37 years, and I did the Middle East job in DFAT quite 3 times, in fact, in the course of my time in Canberra. But if I tried to think of why I had a distinctive career, it would probably come down to 2 things. Firstly, when I joined in 1971, I was probably the only diplomat who knew how to kill, skin and dress a sheep. And secondly, I'm probably the only Australian official I know who managed to have a crowd stoning his office while at the same time the ladies supported by his micro-enterprise program sold soft drinks to the crowd. But I was a Middle East tragic. I found that I was there to work, and I became deeply involved in Arab society in various ways. And I did that essentially because I believed that if I was going to be effective in conveying Australia's perceptions, our interests, defending our interests, achieving operational outcomes and so on, I really needed to be inside the minds of the people with whom I was dealing to a very advanced degree. And I was reminded of this when my wife, Jenny, was in Damascus in the late 70s. And she was walking through Souk Hamadiya, which is a wonderful market area. And there was a stall out on the street of a man selling ladies' underwear with spangles and feathers and canaries in improbable places. And the stall was being carefully gone through by ladies in traditional Damascene black, examining the merchandise. And Jenny went over to the stall owner and said, how can you explain this, conservative women and underwear like that? Said the Damascene. And when a Syrian says, you know that this is going to be good. You foreigners, when you look at Syria, you just see the mountain. But we in Damascus, we see the volcano underneath. And this is the sort of environment that does take time to understand and to interpret. The risk, of course, in developing an appreciation or an empathy, if you like, with the collective memories and historical imagination, if you like, of the people with whom you deal, is that those myths and those memories have considerable poetic power. And you can't operate in that environment without an appreciation of those myths and memories, but by God, you've got to learn to measure the dosage. And that is one of the most significant professional challenges I found over the nearly 40 years with DFAT and subsequent years as an academic, as a business person, as an analyst and various other things. I tried to be free of tribal delusions, except where Collingwood's concerned. But it was never a simple matter to do that. I wanted to mention three key lessons that I drew from my 50 years now, in fact, of engagement with the region. The first is that Middle East policy is not a morality play. Politics are part of life in the Middle East. Expediency, whether it is political or alliance related, will always shape decisions. And there will be visceral emotions, there will be moments of agitation with which one has to contend. But to approach the Middle East without a clear focus on the ends that you wish to achieve and a very clear understanding of what means are required to achieve those ends is an exercise in futility. The second lesson is that one has to be extremely cautious about assumptions which are based on one's own values. I've spent a career listening to urbane interlocutors, be they Arab or Israeli or Westerners, Iranians, and all too often that presentation of their analysis, their views, their arguments has been tuned to what they believed, or what they assumed my values would be. And in reality, those efforts to persuade may be a considerable distance from the complex reality that drives Middle East life and society and politics. Shades of grey are the predominant characteristics of dealing with the region. When you have people in Syria or who have fled Syria producing wonderful, gripping documentaries about the suffering of Syrians and the hope for a brighter future of democracy and societies that are progressive, the reality is somewhat different. You are more likely to find that those young men who went onto the streets in Daraa or Homs or Aleppo did so for reasons which had very little to do with Western notions of democracy, open society, progress and rights and so on. They're more likely to have done so out of humiliation at the hands of the regime, or a sense of desire to address the inequities that their family had encountered at the hands of local officials and so on. Sure, it's important to engage with people who are there representing a view, but it is no less important to understand the dynamics of the society with which you are dealing, which may have precious little connection to those urbane intellectuals who happen to have the opportunity to impress you. The third lesson is that in the Middle East, problems almost invariably grow more intractable, not less. We used to take our kids up to the citadel in Aleppo, a wonderful place overlooking the old city, and we would tell them, poor kids, that all right, it's 12:59, you're the Emir or the Emira of Aleppo. An ultra-punk group known as Hulagu and the Mongols have just had a very successful season in Baghdad, 12:58, brought the house down, literally. They're on their way. What are you going to do? Are you going to fight? Are you going to suggest to them that you'll pay them off and if they head down the road to those nasty people down in Damascus? Will you throw out the non-essential staff, the Christians and others, and hunker down in the citadel in the hope that a dynastic dispute back home or typhoid will resolve the problem for you? The point we were getting across to our kids was that your choices in the Middle East are almost invariably between bad and much, much worse. I found policy in working on policy in the region personally enriching, but I also appreciate that it is a policy and career graveyard. The Middle East is where policy goes to die, as an American once said. It's great to be a commentator on the Titanic, smelling ice from the bridge. It's great to be an academic, encouraging students to reflect on their own values and in debating issues. And in fact, I was just having a bit of a chat with the interns here about that. But policy advice tests your values, your intellectual honesty, and often your endurance. So be kind to your policy advisors. Understand that they have the task of trying to link ends and means in that awkward grey space between policy advice and political decision making, and they don't always succeed. If I looked at the four greatest areas of policy challenge that I encountered, they come under four headings: occasional, structural, analytical, and the conundrums. As an example of the occasional situations you face, in 1996, I encountered a very substantial challenge when the Howard government came to power. The Australian position on Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian statehood had been clearly laid down from the late 1970s under Malcolm Fraser and under Labor. It was a well-established Australian position which was forward-leaning. We're actually ahead of the Europeans in some respects. And it covered our bases quite adequately because, quite frankly, no one in the Middle East is particularly interested in Australia's position on those particular questions. Hit the generalities and stay with the music, be at the rear of every vanguard. But when the Howard government came to power, the Prime Minister determined that there would be no departure from the coalition policy on those issues, which he himself had written, and which made no mention, in fact, of self-determination or statehood. It referred only to Palestinian autonomy. And unfortunately, I was given this news as I walked into the Zionist Federation of Australia biennial dinner by a good friend of ours, Michael Thorley. And with Mr. Howard sitting roughly where Ian is tonight, Michael Thorley, the Prime Minister's advisor, and I had a stand-up shouting match. Amongst other things, I pointed out that the content of Downer's speech the following day, which Downer had approved, differed substantially from what the Prime Minister had just instructed. And moreover, we would almost certainly lose the support of the Arab states for our Security Council candidacy if we chose to say the things that the Prime Minister would prefer. Well, things became quite noisy. I wouldn't say heated, but certainly noisy. And it was completely inappropriate. It was far more entertaining than the speech that the Prime Minister subsequently gave. But there was an intervention by the Downer staff, and the Downer speech was amended accordingly. The point is that one needs to be aware that, as I said at the outset, politics will play a part in your decision making, in the advice that is eventually accepted or rejected. But one needs to have a sense of one's own moral and intellectual authority in putting forward that advice and be prepared to defend it. On structural issues, you will have considerable difficulty identifying where does the national interest lie on Middle East issues. Again, it's a political question as much as it is a foreign policy one. But what values do you want ministers to pursue? And if you are fronting a hard-pressed minister, how do you explain to him why he or she needs to do this in the immediate context of their political situation? Analytically, the challenges are all, in my experience, between vaguely expressed principles of the need for reform in the Arab world, the respect for human rights and democratic values and so forth, and the need for order. In my experience, from Beirut to Benghazi, justice cannot be delivered in the absence of order. But if the Arab world is to surmount the challenges that are now apparent and which will grow worse over the coming decade, demographic, environmental, human, economic and financial, amongst others, they need to galvanise the energy, the intellectual skills, the capacities of the younger generation. People need to have a voice in decisions that affect them. So you have this constant tension between order versus notions of justice. And for an outsider to become involved in that process is fraught with dangers. And finally, the policy conundrums. Where do you go on issues such as human rights? Where do you come out on questions of Western engagement with the region, particularly when it becomes a question of the imposition of sanctions upon recalcitrant regimes? Is it possible to present a values-based approach to human rights, for example, in one context but not in another? My argument is that credibility matters in foreign policy. If we want to argue that our identity and our values are to be reflected in our foreign policy, we must be consistent. We must try, at least, to be consistent. But when increasing the vulnerability of children is accepted as a legitimate instrument of policy, I believe our rhetoric about our values rings very hollow indeed. I don't believe we can afford to demonstrate inconsistency in the application of our values, including where Israeli behaviour contrary to international law is concerned. And no Western government, including our own, should abide policy goals in Syria or Palestine or Iran that are pursued through collective punishment. Only a few minutes left, I'll talk briefly about the Middle East outlook and then about Israel and Palestine and Australian policy. It's really too soon to predict when the next wave of Arab political events might in due course emerge. It'll be when there is hope for an alternative, and at the moment that hope is lacking. The mobilisation that we saw a decade ago now was largely submerged in most cases by arguments that freedom is more likely to produce chaos than social justice. But that argument is wearing thin. The ice is thinning, especially among the marginalised urban communities of the particularly of the non-oil producing Arab world. I see an increasingly alienated Arab middle class in non-oil exporting countries who seem to be consistently on the brink of impoverishment now. And the rural poor, those who provided the cannon fodder in the uprising in Syria and elsewhere a decade ago, are still impoverished and still frustrated and still moving into the outskirts of urban areas. From an outsider's perspective, the way forward demands a process with transparent, inclusive institutions, developing a new and broadly accepted paradigm of modernity that can attract the energy and the creativity and the support of young Arabs. But as Ian said, Bukra fil mishmish, tomorrow there will be apricots, my cynical Arab friends would say, because they don't see how it can happen. My argument is, of course, it took the Titanic a long time to sink, and especially in the movie. On Israel and Palestine, it pains me very deeply and very personally, because I fought very hard to defend the two-state approach. But it pains me deeply that approach, which the US and courageous Israelis and courageous Palestinians invested for 30 years, is now beyond hope, beyond redemption, beyond salvation. Even in the land of miracles, the Middle East is not going to see a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Security for both Israelis and Palestinians now rests in achieving a just settlement within a single state that treats Israelis and Palestinians as equals. But the prospects of a start even being made in that direction by either Israelis or Palestinians are remote. Neither side is prepared emotionally or organised politically and ideologically to make that sort of shift. Instead, we have the vested interests of all sides, including obviously the Palestinian Authority, as well as Western governments and Arab governments, in maintaining the convenient fiction that a two-state approach is still possible. But in the absence of genuine political engagement between Israelis and Palestinians, I believe we are looking not at a future which should be welcomed, but rather one that should be filmed by Quentin Tarantino. The political crisis in Israel, of course, everyone's aware of that at the moment, goes back to a fundamental question of whether Israel is meant to be a Jewish state or a state for all its Jewish citizens. And that's an unresolved question. It's been unresolved since 1948. But neither the question of whether it should be Jewish or a state for all its citizens addresses the fundamental issues of demography versus democracy and the occupation. And until those questions are resolved, neither side can look forward to security. I believe that rather than a two-state solution, I think we should not rule out a de facto 2.5 state outcome for the coming decade. It may comprise a state, in effect functioning for the ultra-nationalist and religious Jews, currently aligned with the Prime Minister, a state functioning for the remainder of Israel's Jews and the Palestinians from 1948 who live in Israel as citizens in a divided country, and a half-state, a semi-state for the remaining Palestinians, which will struggle with external support to maintain at least the symbols and the service delivery of statehood, which will lack genuine sovereignty. And some might argue that that future is already with us. As far as Australia is concerned, in a minute and a half, I think we need to recognise that the modern Arab world has no way to stop the drivers of change that are reshaping it. They're generational and they're societal, and we must recognise that our interests are affected by those changes, and we need to respond to it. Our engagement with the Arab world has to be based on a deep appreciation of its changing social, political, cultural dynamics. DFAT, other government agencies, universities, parliamentarians, business people, military, all need to be equipped for that purpose. And why is that important? It's because at risk for Australia is the outlook for securing respect for those values we believe to be of universal relevance, which underpin our identity, as our ministers like to say, and which serve our interests. At the end of the day, I'm still an interest-driven old warhorse. Upholding values in foreign policy is difficult. It's a recipe for conceptual mush and policy confusion. But however difficult it may be, it is still better than the alternative. We have to speak and act according to our values, our identity, not only to feel good about ourselves, which is not to be sneezed at, and to be consistent in our advocacy at home and abroad. I don't want to see Australians advocating for values in one place and not being prepared to advocate for those values at home as well. But most importantly, it is in our interests for the international system to be strengthened by observation of those values we consider important. We also have a responsibility to listen and to respond where we can to those who carry the burdens of and the opportunities of a changing Middle East. It is Arabs and Iranians who have to decide and respond according to their own sense of what it means to be Arab or Iranian in this century. For Australia, like other Western countries, turning away from the region will neither help those countries to resolve those problems, nor will it prevent serious challenges to our own values, security and other interests. I began in the Middle East in 1973, in the middle of an oil crisis. I've lived through Kuwait, I lived through Iraq, I've lived through refugee outflows into Europe. The one consistent, and 9/11, the one consistent message that I have over 50 years of engagement with the Middle East is that if you turn your back on it long enough, it will bite you on the bum. And interests-based engagement in Australia and the Arab world, combined with the ethical use of such powers we may have in support of our values, is surely preferable to standing back and hoping for the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
My pleasure.
It's a great pleasure now to declare Farewell the Apricots officially launched in New South Wales.
Thank you.
And a reminder that copies can be bought in our office this evening.
And I'll be very happy to sign off.
There you go, signed copies for no extra charge.
No, I didn't say that.
We now have half an hour for questions, and that question and answer session will be presided over by our Vice President, Tom Dixon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks very much for your presentation. Just shifting to contemporary events, I just wanted to get your opinion on the recent agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran brokered by China, the normalization of diplomatic relations. To outside observers, this seems like a seismic shift. Just wondered what your opinion was on the implications for Middle East power politics and the US's role will continue to have a significant role to play? Thank you.
Thank you. I could give you a very long answer to that, but I'll try to stick to a couple of key points. Yes, it is a very important step, and it's one to be very strongly welcomed. But I add the cautionary note that all this is so far is the continuation of a discussion that's been going on now for a couple of years, sometimes brokered by Iraq, more recently with the assistance of Oman and now China facilitating, to identify those aspects of the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia that are capable of being managed in a more open forum and which will provide a basis for identification of those possibilities for constructive engagement. The process itself will be put to the test over the next couple of months because before embassies will be opened, there will have to be some tangible progress made on such issues as Yemen, on which we have yet to see how the Iranians, how successful the Iranians will be in brokering an outcome with the Houthi rebels in Yemen that enables relatively predictable dealings between the Houthis and the Saudis going forward. It is, to my mind, a significant development because it does reduce somewhat the risk of the emergence, in the absence of a dialogue, of a nuclear arms race emerging in the region over the course of the next decade. If they can sustain a dialogue, that will reduce that risk, I think, quite substantially. It's a process that highlights the determination of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf to make their own foreign policy choices, taking account, obviously, of American sensitivities, but not being constrained ultimately by those sensitivities. The Americans have ground to make up in the region because they are perceived widely in the region to be a less reliable guarantor of the region's security than was the case 20 years ago. I can point to a couple of specific trigger elements of that that have helped to shape that perception. But as a general point, I think you will find that there is now a greater concern on the part of the countries of the region to hedge their bets and to look for ways in which they can develop a more stable relationship with each other, irrespective of whether the Americans can be relied upon to provide an umbrella for them. One final thing, I would not overstate the importance of the fact that China is at the forefront of this, of the publicity surrounding this latest step. The Chinese are major customers for both Iran and Saudi. They carry no historical baggage in the region, unlike almost everyone from the Western side and the Russians. But the Chinese need to be very wary, and this is what surprised me a little, because if you're going to be a broker between the Iranians and the Saudis, there will be an expectation that you will help to deliver the outcomes that are required to make this deal work. And I don't know how much influence the Chinese have with the Houthis, but I don't think it's very much.
Thank you. One of the things I've read with the war in Ukraine is that all the West, democratic countries are very occupied with that. At the same time, the global south is not focused on that at all, which leaves the Middle Eastern countries, if you like, something that doesn't seem to be focused on so much. And what do you would you agree with that, and what do you think the implications of that are?
The Arab states, with one or two exceptions, and Kuwait is one of them, have abstained on votes regarding Ukraine. They regard it in many cases as a conflict which does not directly impact upon their interests, and that Western concerns about democracy and human rights, etc., which are very much part of the Western appreciation of why Ukraine matters, are not issues of consequence in the Arab world. So they don't feel an ideological engagement in the issue in the way that Western countries tend to do, nor do they have a strategic interest, again, in the way that the Europeans would have. In addition to that, you have a very long-standing relationship, obviously, between the United States and the Arab states in the Gulf, but you also have a very long-standing Russian connection to the region. The Russians have the role, if you like, of alternate arms supplier in mind. They have a depth of sophistication in their understanding of the Arab world that very few Western countries have. My Russian colleagues were always wonderful to talk to because they had practically grown up with the same people that I wanted to talk to. My Russian colleague in Cairo knew the left wing of the PLO. I was pretty familiar with the right wing. We used to have wonderful exchanges, but the depth of their appreciation of what was making Palestinian society and its elements tick was truly impressive. And the Russians have a transactional approach, and as do the Chinese, which resonates in the Arab world. We're much less transactional in our thinking about it than they are. So they can play their cards, the cards they have, which are not great cards compared to those which the United States could muster, but they can play their hands very well indeed.
Again, thank you very much for the talk. One question from the Australian perspective. In your last sentence, you mentioned the morals, the values, and the interests that Australia shouldn't turn back to the Middle East. And so, in your perspective, looking a bit forward, what are the opportunities or the risks that the Middle East might pose to Australia? And what kind of a toolbox Australia policymakers has in order to influence those opportunities or risks in order to face the future?
The one that always resonates with me is our position on the issues that are raised by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If we insist on the observance of international law, if we refer to judgments in international law, international humanitarian law, in our Asian context, then we should be no less rigorous in referring to those considerations when we look at breaches of international law in the Israeli-Palestinian context. Whether it's settlements or the status of Jerusalem, we cannot be seen to be picking and choosing between those environments in which we want to stand on a matter of principle. I remember my Tunisian colleague once telling me that Sometimes, my friend, there are higher values than consistency. Maybe, but if you're going to make that case, you have to make it, if you're going to make that argument, you have to make it case by case and be prepared to wear costs to our credibility as an interlocutor on other areas that matter to us.
I'm going to ask a sort of a practical question, if you don't mind. You said that the Australians are hardly noticed in the Middle East. Must make life very difficult to try to actually influence anything, knowing that your colleague operating in Washington probably has more say about Australia's policy in the Middle East than you did. What I'd like to know is, as you juggle your role between consular and diplomatic duties, between naughty Australians on tour and between the more high-level stuff that you're being asked about today, is how did you yourself deal with the difference between the states of the Middle East and the people of the Middle East in order to at least give solid advice back to your bosses back here in Canberra?
I think when we're talking about consular matters, and I've had the sad experience of dealing with some major consular events, a bus crash in Cairo that killed 6 Australians and injured 26 more. Had a consular case in what is now South Sudan, where an Australian was unjustly convicted of murder, and that judgment had to be reversed. And I've had a number of other engagements in consular matters, but nothing gets a higher priority, nor should it get a higher priority at a working level for an ambassador or an embassy than protecting the lives of Australians in peril. But I found that to get results, again, you had to understand the context within which you were working, and you had to have a team that would back you when you had to make judgment calls about what was going to work and what would not. But you had to respect the institutional framework within which you were working, even if you tried to understand what was going on behind the scenes in order to achieve something. So let me give you the example, which is more or less on the public record, about Sudan, where, as I said, an Australian was and his colleagues were unjustly convicted of murder by a judge who, in the absence of a police prosecutor, prosecuted the case himself, and being well pleased with his performance, he found the Australian guilty in the absence of forensic or motive or any other reason for doing so. And at that point, the issue had to be taken to a higher court. Now, the problem was that the Australian and his colleagues were going to die in jail. They were in a jail in Rumbek, which was built and later bombed, but meant to accommodate about 200 men. It had about 560 in there, no toilets, malaria, measles, a range of other things going on at the time, typhoid. They were going to die before this matter could get to the higher court. I had to mobilise the Sudanese judicial system in the south to address this problem. And I did that by not only finding the relevant judge who was going to chair the review panel, but also finding the registrar of the judiciary of Southern Sudan and getting him to help me with the Chief Justice and all of this, get bail issued and so on. Now, the problem was a structural one. On the one hand, I had a judge who desperately wanted advice as to how he could address this case and advice that was being prepared by a wonderful team in Melbourne, led by Coroner Cordner and a number of other senior figures in the legal fraternity in Melbourne. And the weight against that was the Registrar of the Judiciary, who quite reasonably was arguing that the case, if there was a shortcoming in the performance of the judicial system, it had to be fixed by the judicial system itself, not by outsiders coming in and telling them their business. So I had to make some judgment calls as to how we were going to do this. And I had some productive discussions with the registrar. I won't go into what they were, but we became good friends. I had some productive discussions with the Chief of Police, who accepted a somewhat, he was slightly underwhelmed, but accepted a very general letter in which I offered the acting Vice Consul as the person who would stand in for the prisoner so he could be released on bail. I didn't ask Canberra about that. And I arranged for the judge of the Court of Review to acquire the information provided from Australia by virtue of his clerk having a beer with one of my staff and loading it onto his computer. Now that probably stretches the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations a bit close to breaking point, but it does reflect several things. Firstly, you had to know the urgency of a situation. You had to know that the institutions had a life of their own and needed to be taken seriously. And you needed to be flexible enough in your approach and respectful of the circumstances that people were facing to come up with the right result. So I'm sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it might give you some idea of what ambassadors get up to when a consular case is running hot. You do actually need to lead the solution. If there is a solution, and there's not always a solution, but you need to lead that team to come about, to bring that result about.
Thanks. With regard to the West Bank, do you believe that the increasing settler violence, which has been met with impunity usually by the IDF and the local police, the Israeli police that is, and the frustration of young Palestinians, which is leading many of them to join armed groups, do you think that that is leading inexorably towards a third, far more widespread and more violent intifada before we get further down to the progress towards this one-state solution? And in Syria, do you believe, you were talking about the lesser of evils, basically, do you believe that the current response to Assad in not exactly welcoming him back into the fold, but allowing him back into the fold is an example of that?
On settler violence, I absolutely deplore the Israeli view that their military are deployed in the West Bank to protect settlers from Palestinian violence and not to enforce Israeli law where settlers are threatening the lives and the well-being of Palestinians. I think that is a major error on the part of Israel, that that approach has been allowed to prevail for so long. It is fundamentally damaging to the credibility not only of what used to be the two-state approach, but it is deeply, probably, and not probably, but possibly mortally damaging to the Palestinian Authority. The Lions Den and other small groups that are forming up around the West Bank will do no damage to Israel's security beyond the odd terrorist attack. What they will do is bring down the authority of the Palestinian leadership. And that is a process which benefits absolutely nobody, neither Palestinians nor Israelis. as far as the likelihood of another intifada is concerned, I'm too far removed from the picture to say whether that is an imminent possibility, but there are disturbing signs that the Palestinians are losing that sense of expectation that alternatives can be found, and it was particularly distressing to me. This is getting a little bit away from your question, but it was particularly distressing to me that when international attention was focused briefly a year or two ago on the question of Jerusalem and the displacement of Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, that at the time when questions were starting to be asked about whether it was legitimate for Israel to take back or to seize control of property in East Jerusalem, but Palestinians were not permitted to make equivalent claims for property from which they had been forced in 1947-48. There started to be a bit of a discussion about this issue, and it was a positive discussion from the Palestinian point of view. But then that was overtaken dramatically and unhelpfully by the intervention of Hamas and rocket attacks out of Gaza, which shifted what had some chance of being a productive discussion back into a familiar set of tropes about violence, damage to civilians, and never-ending spirals of conflict. So I would hope that the Palestinians have enough resolve to avoid being drawn into those sorts of confrontations again, because they are pointless ultimately and meaningless in terms of joining, achieving the outcomes that Palestinians would wish to see. What I would rather see is a focus on how a one-state solution might look in practice, and how Palestinians can start to reach out to Israelis beyond the Israeli left. How do you reach out to those centrist Israelis who may be persuaded that a relationship with the Palestinians is possible going forward with mutual respect and which can achieve most, but not all, of what both sides would wish to have. There is more to be gained by outreach from Palestinians to Israelis than there is from allowing the situation to deteriorate still further at the expense of having a credible Palestinian interlocutor with their Israeli opposite numbers. On Syria, it's extraordinary. I argued and got into a bit of trouble with my friends that it was long overdue to begin a process of re-engagement with the Assad regime, because sanctions clearly are not doing anything other than penalising ordinary Syrians. They're not shaping the political character of Syria, nor will they. But the likelihood of the Syrians accommodating some of the most basic requests or requirements of their political audience, easing off on police brutality, giving people an opportunity to express criticism of the regime. Those were reasonable demands that could have been made by those states that are now tired of the whole business, those Arab states that are now tired of the whole business and simply want to get back to the way things were with Assad. Instead of conditioning their re-entry of Syria into the Arab fold, I think they're going a bit too quickly, using the earthquake relief as an excuse for doing what they wanted to do anyway.